It's funny. Usually when we talk about like getting a medical diagnosis, there's this intense expectation of precision.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it feels akin to engineering, right? Like if you break your arm, you get the X-ray, it shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points to it. The path forward is completely objectively clear.
Right. You set the bone, you put a cast on it, and you just let the biological machine repair itself.
Exactly. And the appeal of that medical model lies entirely in that certainty.
We love certainty. We have this inherent psychological preference for things that are visible, things we can measure and just put into neat little categories.
Because it gives us the illusion of control, right, over our physical reality.
It does. But, and this is big, but the moment you step into the world of psychology or, psychotherapy, that X-ray machine is rendered completely useless.
Yeah, totally useless. We're looking at a landscape of the human mind that just defies any sort of simple categorization, which brings us to our mission today. We have synthesized literally decades of clinical psychology textbooks for this deep dive.
It's a massive stack of literature.
Oh, it really is. We're drawing on these huge foundational texts by Corey, Gladding, Kotler, Scharf, Summers, Flanagan. Plus, we've got primary works from pioneers like Irvin Yalom and Paul Gilbert to really round it out.
And, what becomes immediately clear when you're reviewing all this literature for you today is that for a really long time, early psychology desperately tried to act like that X-ray machine.
Yeah, it really did.
It wanted so badly to find exactly which wire was broken in the brain so it could just, solder it back together.
But the wave of psychology we're unpacking today, it fundamentally rejected that entire premise. Instead of asking what was broken, these practitioners started asking, well, it's like asking what kind of music the individual actually wanted to play.
That's a great analogy. And that shift, it represents perhaps the most profound philosophical pivot in the entire history of mental health.
So today, we are tracing the evolution of what became known as the third force in psychology.
Right, which encompasses the humanistic and the existential approaches.
The goal here isn't just to give you like a dry historical review. It's really an exploration of how clinical therapy evolved from treating humans as these broken biological mechanisms.
Or animals just blindly driven by instinct.
Yes, exactly. Evolving from that to viewing them as meaning-making, inherently growth-oriented entities.
Because the frameworks we're going to explore today, so that's person-centered, existential Gestalt, and then the modern compassion-focused therapies, these form the absolute bedrock of how our modern society actually understands personal agency.
And self-acceptance.
Right, and emotional regulation. It's all built on this foundation.
So to truly grasp the magnitude of this shift, we really have to look closely at the establishment that they were rebelling against.
The baseline, so to speak.
Yeah, the baseline. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the field of psychology, which, by the way, the texts point out was heavily centralized in Western Europe and the United States and completely dominated by privileged white men. It was ruled by two opposing but equally deterministic forces.
Right, so on one side you had psychoanalysis.
Built on the monumental and, frankly, kind of dark work of Sigmund Freud.
Very dark. Freud's model of human nature was deeply, deeply pessimistic. He posited the structural model of the psyche, right? The ego, the ego, and the superego.
Where the human being is essentially just a battlefield for these unconscious, primitive instincts.
Exactly. In that psychoanalytic framework, particularly classical Freudian drive theory, humans are viewed mostly as energy systems. We are driven by the libido, which are the life and sexual instincts, and then thanatos, the death and aggressive instincts.
It's so intense. The fundamental assumption there is that human beings are essentially just pressure cookers of repressed, dark urges.
And because of that assumption, the goal of therapy, which, often spanned years and years of this intense psychoanalysis, it was never to achieve some transcendent state of happiness.
Right. Happiness wasn't even on the menu.
Not at all. It was merely to make the unconscious conscious so that your ego could better manage and control these destructive biological drives.
I think the literature actually says the highest hope Freud offered was transforming hysterical misery into common unhappiness.
Yeah, common unhappiness was the goal. It paints a picture of humanity trapped in this dark basement of neuroses, just forever managing damage control.
Okay, so that's psychoanalysis. And if you didn't align with that, the other dominant paradigm at the time was behaviorism.
Pioneered by figures like John B. Watson and then later B.F. Skinner.
And they swung the pendulum to the absolute opposite extreme.
Oh, completely. They argued that the internal world So the unconscious, your thoughts, your feelings, your search for meaning, all of that was entirely irrelevant.
Because it couldn't be objectively measured in a lab.
Right. The behaviorists applied this strictly mechanistic, radically empirical lens to human nature. So to a strict Skinnerian behaviorist, you, a human being, are essentially just a complex input-output machine.
Just meat robots, basically.
Essentially, yeah. We're born as blank slates, and our entire personality is nothing more than a collection of learned responses to environmental stimuli.
So normal behavior is simply the result of effective operant conditioning, right?
Yeah.
Like reinforcement and punishment.
Exactly. And abnormal behavior is just faulty learning. They dismiss the whole concept of free will entirely. You are literally just what your environment conditioned you to be.
So if we look at the prevailing therapeutic consensus of the mid-20th century, it offered you this incredibly stark dichotomy.
Right. You are either secretly governed by these repressed aggressive urges from your early childhood,
Or you are a biological automaton programmed by your environment.
picture poison.
It's just so limiting. Neither framework accounts for the human capacity for, like, spontaneous creativity or self-sacrifice.
Or the profound search for existential meaning.
Exactly. And this intellectual and clinical dissatisfaction, it finally reached a boiling point in the post-World War II era.
Which makes sense historically.
Right, we see the emergence of the 1950s and 60s in America. It's a period marked by post-war material affluence, huge cultural upheaval, and just this collective questioning of traditional authority.
And right in the middle of this environment, Abraham Maslow enters the discourse and just fundamentally fractures the psychological establishment.
He really did. Maslow looked at the clinical focus of both psychoanalysis and behaviorism, and he critiqued them for being entirely pathology-centric.
He essentially argued that if a scientific discipline exclusively studies neuroses, psychosis, and distress, it will inevitably produce a crippled, stunted psychology.
Right, like if you only study sick people, you only understand sickness.
Precisely. So Maslow proposed this radical methodological shift. Instead of deducing human nature by only studying the severely mentally ill or, by running rats through mazes,
Which the behaviorists love to do.
which they loved, he said psychologists needed to study the most integrated, healthy, and highly functioning individuals in society.
And he called them self-actualizers.
He did.
So Maslow meticulously studied historical figures and contemporaries too, people like Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, Albert Schweitzer, and the literature outlines these specific traits he observed in them.
Right, things that set them apart from the baseline.
Yeah, like they were heavily problem-centered rather than ego-centered, meaning they focused on external missions or callings rather than just endlessly circling their own internal anxieties.
They also possess a really high degree of autonomy, a resistance to blind enculturation. Like they didn't just follow the herd.
And they had this, I love this phrase, a freshness of appreciation for everyday life. Plus, they frequently experienced what Maslow called peak experiences.
Which are these moments of profound unity and transcendence.
So what Maslow extrapolated from studying these specific individuals was a fundamentally new theory of human motivation. He wanted to transition away from deficiency needs to what he termed being needs, or be needs.
Because psychoanalysis and behaviorism, they operated almost entirely on deficiency models. We act to reduce tension, we eat to satiate hunger, we do things to alleviate anxiety.
It's all about fixing a lack of something.
Exactly. And Maslow acknowledged those physiological and safety needs, obviously, but he argued that once those baseline deficiencies are actually met, human beings are naturally driven by a self-actualizing tendency.
We have this innate biological thrust toward growth, toward creativity, and just realizing our absolute highest potential.
Which brings us to the core philosophical assumption of humanistic psychology. It flips the psychoanalytic script completely on its head.
Because humanists assert that humans are not inherently destructive or aggressive at all.
Right. At our core, they say we are inherently good, or at very least neutral and completely growth-oriented.
Okay, but, and I have to play devil's advocate here because this is where I get tripped up, this immediately invites a huge clinical challenge.
I know where you're going with this.
Like, if human beings possess this innate, beautiful drive toward goodness and self-actualization, how on earth do humanists account for the overwhelming historical and clinical evidence of human cruelty? Like, what about psychopathy or people who do terrible, destructive things. Isn't it just a bit naive to assume everyone is fundamentally good?
It's the most common pushback to humanism, absolutely. But the humanistic literature does address this. They conceptualize destructive behavior not as an expression of our innate human nature, but as a tragic deviation from it.
Okay, a deviation. How do they explain that?
The analogy they often use in humanistic texts is botanical. Think of a plant. A plant possesses an innate genetic blueprint that drives it to grow toward the sunlight, to establish deep roots, and to flourish.
Right.
That is its actualizing tendency. However, if you take that seed and you place it in a highly toxic environment, you deprive it of water, you lock it in a dark space, its growth is going to become stunted. It's going to grow twisted, and it might even develop defense mechanisms like becoming toxic itself just to survive.
Oh, wow. Okay, I see.
The humanists argue that humans are identical in this regard. Destructive behavior is the result of a fundamentally healthy organism attempting to survive in an emotionally barren or actively hostile environment.
So it's not that the person is bad, it's that they've been kept in the dark.
Precisely. They've wandered away from their basic nature because the environment forced them to.
That is a fascinating reframing. But that philosophical shift, it demands a completely new clinical approach, doesn't it?
Entirely new.
Because if pathology is the result of a toxic environment stunting your natural growth, then the role of the therapist is no longer to be this detached expert who just analyzes your unconscious drives or administers behavioral rewards and punishments.
No, the therapist's job is to completely reconstruct the environment.
Which brings us to the monumental contributions of Carl Rogers.
Yes, Rogers.
Because he took Maslow's high-level observations and he transformed them into a highly structured clinical methodology, what we now know as person-centered therapy.
And in doing so, Rogers initiated a paradigm shift that really remains the foundation of almost all modern therapeutic alliances today.
Yeah, he completely changed the power dynamic, right?
He did. Prior to Rogers, the power dynamic in a clinical setting was incredibly skewed. The doctor was the absolute arbiter of truth.
The doctor knows best.
Always.
Right.
And the patient was merely the subject to be interpreted. But Rogers dismantled that hierarchy completely. He posited that the client is the ultimate expert on their own internal experience.
Right, which sounds so obvious to us now, but at the time, that was radical.
It was heresy to the psychoanalysts. But Rogers believed the client inherently possesses these vast internal resources required for self-understanding and for altering their own self-concept and behavior. The therapist's sole function is just to facilitate the specific psychological climate that allows the client to access those resources.
So to understand how Rogers constructed this climate, we really have to examine his theory of how we become disconnected from our internal resources in the first place.
Why do we get stuck?
Exactly. And the foundational concept here in the texts is conditions of worth.
This is such a crucial concept.
It really is. Rogers observed that humans possess this deep organismic need for positive regard from others, especially from our primary caregivers when we're little.
We need to be loved and prized.
But in almost all developmental environments, this positive regard is conditional.
Yes. A child learns very early on that they are prized and loved only if they achieve certain academic standards, or if they suppress their anger or conform to specific family expectations.
I will love you if you are quiet. I will love you if you get straight A's.
Exactly. And these conditions of worth initiate a profound psychological fracture. The child begins to evaluate their own internal experiences not by how they actually feel, but by how their caregivers will perceive them.
So if a child feels genuine anger, but they've learned that showing anger results in their parents withdrawing love,
they will begin to deny that anger, not just to the parent, but eventually to themselves. They interject the parent's values.
and this creates what Rogers termed incongruence, right?
Yes, incongruence. It's this widening chasm between the organismic self, which is who the person actually is and what they truly feel, and the ideal self, who the person feels they must be in order to maintain connection and just survive.
And the literature stresses that this incongruence is the root of psychological distress in the person-centered model. The wider the gap between the real self and the ideal self, the more vulnerable the individual is to anxiety, to defensiveness, and just a feeling of profound alienation.
Because the individual is essentially living a performance. They are constantly monitoring their internal state and repressing anything that violates those internalized conditions of worth. It's exhausting.
So the clinical intervention requires reversing that whole process. Rogers hypothesized that if conditions of worth cause the pathology, then the cure must be the provision of a relationship that is entirely devoid of those conditions.
Yes. He formalized this into what he called the necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic personality change.
And there are three core conditions that form the absolute bedrock here.
Right. So the first one is congruence, or genuineness on the part of the therapist.
Which was a massive departure from the psychoanalytic tradition, right? The whole blank screen thing.
Oh, completely. Psychoanalysts deliberately obscured their own personalities. They wouldn't even have family photos on the desk. They wanted the client to project their unconscious conflicts onto them.
But Rogers argued the therapist must be a fully integrated, transparent human being in the room.
Congruence requires the therapist's internal experience to actually match their external expression.
So if the therapist feels bored or confused or frustrated by the client, they don't hide behind a mask of professional neutrality.
No, they respectfully and constructively bring those feelings right into the therapeutic relationship.
Which sounds terrifying, but the mechanism is deeply relational, isn't it?
It is. By modeling absolute authenticity, the therapist provides a grounding reality. It signals to the client, hey, this therapeutic space is one where pretense is unnecessary. And that gives the client implicit permission to drop their own highly curated social mask.
Okay, so that's congruence. The second core condition, and probably the most famous one, is unconditional positive regard.
Yes, UPR.
This requires the therapist to deeply prize and accept the client, without any stipulations, without judgments, without evaluations.
It's a non-possessive caring.
But the literature is very careful to distinguish this from simply agreeing with everything the client does, right? Like I always compare it to a parent loving a toddler.
Okay, how so?
Well, you might strongly dislike that your toddler just drew all over the living room walls with a permanent marker. But you don't stop loving the toddler. You accept the person, even if you completely reject the behavior.
That is the perfect analogy. The texts really expand on this. It requires separating the organismic value of the person from their behavioral output.
So if a client comes in and they're engaging in severe substance abuse or they're acting out aggressively toward their partner, the therapist doesn't validate the substance abuse.
Exactly. They look beneath the behavior to the underlying human suffering. The stance is, I will accept you as you are in this moment, in all your complexity and pain. It's not, I'll accept you when you sober up. It's, I accept you now.
Which is the specific antidote to those conditions of worth.
It provides profound psychological relief. When a client experiences a relationship where their inherent value is not constantly under threat of being revoked, their psychological defenses finally begin to soften.
Because they no longer need to expend massive amounts of cognitive and emotional energy hiding their perceived flaws. They can just breathe.
Right, which leads directly into the third core condition, accurate empathic understanding.
And this goes way beyond just basic sympathy or, like, reflective listening.
Way beyond. Accurate empathy involves the therapist temporarily setting aside their own worldview and stepping completely into the client's phenomenological world.
You literally have to crawl inside the client's frame of reference.
You have to sense their feelings and their personal meanings exactly as they experience them, and then effectively communicate that profound understanding back to the client.
And when a client feels truly, deeply understood without being judged, it catalyzes this really powerful reintegration of the self.
Rogers actually argued that these three conditions, congruence, unconditional positive regard, and empathy, were not just helpful techniques. He boldly asserted they were entirely sufficient for psychological change.
Meaning you didn't need anything else. No dream analysis, no behavioral rewards.
Right. And while contemporary clinical psychology has definitely integrated more active techniques since then, decades of empirical outcome research have consistently validated Rogers' core premise.
The relationship is what heals.
Exactly. The quality of the therapeutic alliance is the single most significant predictor of successful treatment outcomes across all modalities.
Wow. Okay, and here is where the story takes a really interesting turn. Providing that warm, supportive soil for growth is only the first step.
Right.
Because when the humanistic framework successfully dismantles a client's conditions of worth, something incredibly disorienting occurs.
The client suddenly realizes they are no longer bound by the expectations of their parents or society.
They achieve total psychological freedom.
But the immediate, inescapable byproduct of total freedom is absolute responsibility.
Yes. If you are the author of your own life, you suddenly have to determine the plot, the meaning, and the direction entirely on your own.
And that realization bridges the gap between the optimistic growth orientation of humanism and the stark, heavy, philosophical weight of existential therapy.
Yeah, the existentialists don't pull any punches. And the geographical and cultural origins of existential therapy provide such a vital contrast to humanism here.
Because Maslow and Rogers, they were developing their theories amidst the post-war economic boom and optimism of the United States.
The suburbs, the white picket fences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But existential psychology was forged in the absolute devastation of war-torn Europe.
The texts show it draws heavily from philosophers like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Sartre, but its most poignant clinical application was developed by Viktor Frankl.
An Austrian psychiatrist who formulated his approach while surviving the horrors of Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz.
It's just staggering to think about. Frankl's seminal work, Man's Search for Meaning, is basically foundational to existential psychotherapy, and his observations within the camps force a radical reevaluation of human motivation.
Because if you think about it, Freud argued humans were driven by pleasure. Adler argued we were driven by power.
But Frankl observed that in a situation where all pleasure is eradicated and all personal power is entirely stripped away, human beings are still driven by something. They are driven by a fundamental will to meaning.
He noted that survival rates in the camps were not solely dependent on physical robustness. Individuals who could construct or maintain a sense of profound meaning, whether it was the hope of reuniting with a loved one, a deeply held religious faith, or even just the self-assigned responsibility of surviving to bear witness to the atrocities, those individuals demonstrated a psychological resilience that often correlated with survival.
So Frankl developed logotherapy, which translates the therapy through meaning.
And he famously leaned on that Nietzsche assertion, "He who has a why to live for can bear with almost anyhow."
That quote just gives me chills. Frankl posited that meaning is not something we just invent. It is something we detect. We discover it.
Right. And he outlined 3 primary ways we discover it: by creating a work or doing a deed, by experiencing something or encountering someone, like the experience of deep love, and most crucially for his framework, by the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering.
That third point is the crucible of existential therapy, because we cannot always control our external circumstances. Frankl obviously had absolutely zero control over his imprisonment.
But the existentialists assert that between a stimulus and our response to it, there is a space. And in that space lies our freedom to choose our attitude.
The last of the human freedoms is the ability to choose one's own way, regardless of the physical or psychological confinement.
It's incredibly empowering, but also incredibly demanding.
Well, yeah, but existentialism isn't solely focused on extreme trauma like the camps. It actually provides a very comprehensive framework for everyday psychological distress.
Right. To understand its modern clinical application, the texts point us to Irvin Yalom. He really translated existential philosophy into practical psychotherapy.
And Yalom argues that underlying all our specific neuroses, like our relationship issues, our workplace anxieties, our phobias, is a deeper layer of existential dread.
He outlines 4 ultimate concerns, or givens of existence, that every single human being must grapple with.
Death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness.
Heavy stuff. Yalom's framework posits that psychopathology arises primarily from our elaborate, often completely unconscious attempts to deny or avoid these 4 givens.
Okay, let's examine death first, because this is fascinating. Yalom describes death as whirring continuously beneath the membrane of life.
It is the ultimate boundary condition.
And existentialists argue that a huge portion of human behavior is driven by death anxiety. We build these elaborate defense mechanisms to deny our mortality.
Yalom highlights 2 primary defenses. The first is the belief in personal specialness.
Right, the unconscious conviction that the rules of biology apply to everyone else, but not to me.
Exactly. This often manifests as reckless counterphobic behavior, like extreme sports or reckless driving. It's a way of proving to yourself that death can't touch you.
And the second defense is the belief in an ultimate rescuer, like projecting godlike protective qualities onto a partner or a political leader or even a therapist.
Hoping someone else will save you from the void.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If a listener is struggling, why on earth would focusing on death make them feel better? It sounds incredibly bleak.
It does sound bleak, but the existential perspective suggests that a full appreciation of one's mortality actually catalyzes a profound shift.
A shift from what to what?
A shift from a trivial mode of existence, where you're obsessing over status or minor annoyances or material accumulation, to an authentic mode of existence. When a therapist confronts a client's death anxiety, the goal is not to plunge them into morbid depression. It's to use the reality of death as an awakening experience.
Oh, I see. So accepting death means you stop wasting time. You prioritize deep relationships and meaningful pursuits because you know the clock is ticking.
Exactly. The boundary of death gives the interior of life its structure and its urgency. Acknowledging death makes life intensely vibrant.
Wow, okay, that reframes it completely. So the second given is freedom, which initially sounds like a positive concept, right? We all want freedom.
We think we do, but in the existential framework, freedom is a source of profound dread.
Because existential freedom means the absence of external structure. It means we are fundamentally groundless.
As Sartre stated, we are condemned to be free. This means we are the absolute authors of our own choices, our actions, and our life situations.
And the terror of freedom is the crushing weight of that responsibility. If I am the author of my life, I can no longer blame my genetics or my parents or my socioeconomic status or my boss for my misery.
You are no longer a victim of circumstance. It forces you to take the wheel. And the literature shows that clients utilize massive amounts of energy to avoid this responsibility.
Yeah, how do they avoid it?
They engage in compulsivity, acting as if an irresistible external force is dictating their behavior. They displace responsibility onto others. Or they just remain paralyzed in indecision, because to make a definitive choice means killing off all other potential realities.
So the existential therapist relentlessly confronts this avoidance.
Mm.
They force the client to own their agency with questions like, how did you create the very situation you are complaining about?
It's very direct. And then the third ultimate concern is existential isolation.
Now, this is distinct from just everyday interpersonal loneliness, right?
Yes. Existential isolation is the unbridgeable epistemological gap between any two consciousnesses. We enter existence alone and we must depart it alone. No matter how deeply we love someone, we can never fully merge our internal experience with theirs.
We are always on some level separate.
And this inherent isolation creates tension. We desire deep connection and fusion with others to alleviate the terror of isolation. But if we fuse too completely, we lose our own identity and autonomy.
The clinical implication here is huge. Because a lot of dysfunctional relationship dynamics like codependency, enmeshment, or the chronic inability to be single, the existentialists view those as frantic attempts to evade existential isolation.
Exactly. The existential therapist guides the client to accept their fundamental aloneness, because only when a person can tolerate their own isolation can they form relationships based on genuine love and appreciation, rather than just using the other person as a shield against the void.
That makes so much sense.
Okay,
Finally, we arrive at meaninglessness.
the fourth giving.
Right. If we must die, if we must construct our own reality in groundless freedom, and if we are ultimately alone in the universe, then it naturally follows that the universe possesses no inherent preordained meaning.
We are thrust into an indifferent world. The crisis of the modern secular individual is the mandate to invent their own values and purposes.
And when individuals fail to construct meaning, they fall into what Frankl called the existential vacuum,
Characterized by profound boredom, apathy, a sense of futility.
which is often masked by compulsive consumerism or addiction or hypersexuality.
So the existential framework is unapologetically heavy. It reframes psychological anxiety not as a sickness to be cured, but as a normal, unavoidable reaction to these four heavy truths.
Pathology only arises when we avoid these truths.
Exactly. But while existentialism gives us the grand philosophical why of our lives, it can be highly abstract.
Yeah, like a client might intellectually understand that they are responsible for their own meaning, but how do they actually experience that in the physical, moment-to-moment reality of a Tuesday afternoon?
Right. How do you do it?
To transition from the philosophical why to the physical how, the historical timeline of psychotherapy shifts to the development of Gestalt therapy.
Gestalt therapy, founded by Fritz and Laura Perls, this serves as the vital experiential counterpart to existential philosophy.
Because if psychoanalysis excavates the past, and existentialism peers into the future implications of mortality and freedom, Gestalt is ruthlessly, almost violently, tethered to the present moment.
The term Gestalt refers to a unified whole. The foundational premise is holism. Humans cannot be understood as a collection of separate parts like mind versus body or thoughts versus feelings, but only as a complete entity continually interacting with this environment.
And the texts outline a foundational concept in Gestalt called the figure ground formation.
Right. At any given moment, our awareness focuses on one specific need or sensation, that's the figure, while everything else fades into the background.
So for a healthy individual, a need arises. Let's say intense thirst. It becomes the figure. The person drinks water, the need is satisfied, the thirst fades into the background, and a new figure emerges.
But pathology occurs when this natural flow is disrupted. When a need is ignored, repressed, or incomplete, it forms an unclosed gestalt, or unfinished business.
And this unfinished business lingers in the background, consuming psychological energy and disrupting present awareness.
Often manifesting as physical tension, chronic anxiety, or psychosomatic symptoms.
So to clear this unfinished business, Gestalt therapists employ what they call phenomenological inquiry. They train clients to focus entirely on their immediate, present moment sensory experience.
Fritz Perls frequently summarized this with the equation: now equals experience equals awareness equals reality.
Because the past is gone, the future isn't here.
The past exists only in the present memory of it. The future exists only in present anticipation. The only locus of power in actual experience is the immediate now.
And because of this radical focus on the present, Gestalt therapists implement a really fascinating methodological rule. They rarely ask why questions.
They actively discourage them.
Right. Like if my car breaks down, asking why did this happen to me just leads to a pity party. Asking what is making that grinding noise and how do I fix it actually gets me back on the road. Is that what Pearls was getting at?
Yes, that's exactly it. If a client is experiencing profound sadness and asks, why am I so sad? Is it because my mother neglected me? A Gestalt therapist views this as an intellectual diversion.
A way to escape the feeling.
Asking why removes the client from the visceral experience of the emotion and traps them in cognitive storytelling. Instead, the therapist directs the client to the what and the how.
What are you experiencing in your body right now as you talk about your mother?
How is your breathing changing? How are you avoiding looking at me as you say this? It forces an integration of mind and body.
The therapist is keenly observant of nonverbal cues, right? The tapping of a foot, the clenching of a jaw.
Because these physical manifestations are viewed as expressions of the client's unfinished business.
And it relies on a deeply authentic I-thou connection, borrowed from the philosopher Martin Buber. It demands profound presence from both therapist and client.
The therapist isn't interpreting, they are engaging in a live, unfolding, deeply authentic encounter.
And out of this encounter, Gestalt utilizes specific interventions, differentiating between exercises and experiments.
Exercises are pre-established techniques like dream work. But unlike Freudian analysis, where dreams are interpreted by the therapist for hidden symbols,
Gestalt views every element of a dream as a projected fragment of the client's own personality. The client is asked to act out the different parts of the dream in the present tense.
right, giving voice to the animate and inanimate objects to reintegrate those fragments.
But experiments, on the other hand, are spontaneous activities that grow organically out of the immediate therapeutic dialogue to heighten awareness.
So if a client is discussing a traumatic event but is smiling inappropriately, the therapist points out the incongruence and might design an experiment right there. I notice you are smiling while talking about a devastating loss. I want you to exaggerate that smile. Make it as big as you possibly can and tell me what that smile is trying to accomplish right now.
It's highly confrontational.
It is, but not aggressively. It's to prevent the client from avoiding the present. The therapist is confronting the client's avoidance mechanisms, what Gestalt calls boundary disturbances.
And the textbooks detail several of these boundary disturbances. We discussed interjection earlier with Rogers. There's also projection, where we disown unacceptable parts of ourselves and assign them to others.
In retroflexion, which is a key Gestalt concept, retroflexion is doing to ourselves what we would like to do to someone else, or doing for ourselves what we want someone else to do for us.
So, for example, a person who is furious at their partner but cannot express it might turn that aggression inward, resulting in severe depression or even self-harm.
Exactly. Gestalt experiments are designed to reverse these retroflections, forcing the client to direct that energy outward into the environment where it belongs.
And one of the most famous experiments designed for this is the empty chair technique.
It's a classic. It's a vehicle for role-playing to resolve internal conflicts or unfinished business with external figures.
The client sits across from an empty chair and is instructed to imagine a specific person or even a conflicting part of their own personality, like the critical top dog versus the passive underdog, sitting in that chair.
And the client speaks directly to the chair and then physically moves to the empty chair to respond from that alternative perspective.
It prevents the client from merely talking about the conflict. It forces them to emotionally experience and integrate the conflict in real time.
But as you can imagine, Gestalt demands intense self-awareness. And intense self-awareness can be incredibly painful.
It forces you to strip away all your intellectual defenses and sit squarely in the raw, often agonizing physical reality of your present emotional state.
And the reality is that intense, prolonged contact with our deepest emotional pain can be overwhelmingly dysregulating. If a client is dealing with severe trauma, the unmitigated intensity of Gestalt awareness might lead to panic or dissociation.
Which highlights a gap in the pure humanistic and existential models. They promote awareness and acceptance, but how do we neurologically regulate the nervous system when that awareness becomes intolerable?
This crucial question brings us to the final movement in our historical synthesis: the emergence of the third wave of behavioral therapies, and specifically the integration of mindfulness, acceptance, and compassion.
What is fascinating about the evolution of clinical psychology is that the strict mechanistic behaviorism we discussed at the beginning of the deep dive, the rats and the mazes, it eventually evolved.
It did. Cognitive behavioral therapy added the element of examining thought processes, but the third wave of behaviorism achieved something truly remarkable. It systematically integrated the existential and humanistic goals of mindfulness, acceptance, and present moment awareness, grounding them in empirical neuroscience.
And the foundational text for this integration relies heavily on the concept of mindfulness, derived primarily from Eastern contemplative traditions.
The clinical literature defines mindfulness as paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally.
It's about accepting internal experiences rather than fighting them. It is essentially the operationalization of Roger's unconditional positive regard and Pearl's focus on the now, transformed into a learnable, daily psychological skill.
We see this integration so clearly in modalities like acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT.
ACT completely abandons the traditional medical model goal of symptom reduction, doesn't it?
Yes. The objective in ACT is not to get rid of anxiety or depression. The objective is psychological flexibility. ACT posits that our suffering originates from cognitive fusion, believing our thoughts are absolute truths, and experiential avoidance, running away from difficult emotions.
So through techniques like cognitive diffusion, ACT teaches clients to step back from their thoughts. Instead of thinking, I am a failure, the client learns to observe, I am having the thought that I am a failure.
It creates psychological distance. Crucially, ACT is heavily existential in its second phase: commitment. The client is asked to clarify their deepest personal values and commit to taking action aligned with those values, even while experiencing the discomfort of anxiety.
You accept the internal weather, but you choose to walk toward your values anyway.
Exactly. Parallel to ACT is dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, developed by Marsha Linehan.
And DBT was specifically designed for individuals with severe emotional dysregulation who might be overwhelmed by pure experiential therapies.
Right. DBT introduces the core concept of the dialectic, the simultaneous holding of two opposing truths. The therapist communicates radical acceptance of the client exactly as they are, while simultaneously insisting that the client must learn new behavioral skills to change their life.
And DBT teaches specific modules on distress tolerance, providing clients with concrete physiological techniques to endure excruciating emotional pain without resorting to self-harm.
Guiding them toward what Linehan calls the wise mind, which is the synthesis of pure emotion and pure rationality.
But the piece of this modern synthesis that truly bridges the gap between biological regulation and humanistic philosophy is compassion-focused therapy.
Developed by Paul Gilbert, alongside the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy work of researchers like Kristen Neff, Segal, Williams, and Teasdale.
And Gilbert's model is explicitly rooted in evolutionary psychology and neuroscience. He suggests that the human brain is inherently tricky because it is an evolutionary patchwork.
Gilbert outlines three primary affect regulation systems that govern our neurobiology. The first is the threat and self-protection system.
This is our oldest evolutionary hardware, rooted in the amygdala, driving the fight-flight-freeze response through cortisol and adrenaline. Its only job is to detect danger and keep us alive.
The second is the drive, seeking, and acquisition system. This is modulated by dopamine. It motivates us to seek resources, status, achievement.
And in modern society, particularly in hyper-competitive Western cultures, these two systems are constantly overstimulated. We are perpetually oscillating between the anxiety of the threat system, fear of losing a job, and the relentless driving of the drive system, needing more money, higher status.
But Gilbert identifies a third system, the soothing and affiliative system. This system is driven by oxytocin and endorphins. It is activated when we feel safe, nurtured, and connected to others. It is the biological state of rest and digest.
And the clinical insight of compassion-focused therapy is that in individuals suffering from high shame and self-criticism, this soothing system is profoundly underdeveloped.
When they fail or experience distress, their internal monologue is harsh and punitive, which immediately triggers the threat system. They are essentially attacking themselves, flooding their nervous systems with cortisol.
They lack the neurological infrastructure to self-soothe.
Exactly. So compassion-focused therapy and the broader application of self-compassion is the systematic neurological training of this soothing system, acknowledging shortcomings without critical judgment.
Which brings up a huge question for the listener, because this fundamentally challenges conventional wisdom regarding motivation.
How so?
Well, there is a deeply ingrained cultural belief that brutal self-criticism is necessary to maintain high standards. Like, if I make a terrible mistake at work and I treat myself with compassion, isn't that just letting myself off the hook? Doesn't self-compassion just breed complacency?
It's a very common fear, but the empirical research completely contradicts that assumption. Self-criticism relies on the fear response of the threat system. It can motivate you in the short term, sure, but chronically it leads to burnout, depression, and experiential avoidance. You become so terrified of your own internal whip that you stop taking risks.
Right. Self-loathing acts as a protective shield. Beating yourself up is a performative way of demonstrating remorse without actually having to face the objective reality of your failure. You just label yourself a piece of garbage and hide from the world.
Precisely. Self-compassion is the exact opposite of letting yourself off the hook. It actually requires significantly more courage than self-hatred.
Because it forces you to look at your failures, honestly.
Yes. True self-compassion involves applying Rogers' unconditional positive regard to your own psyche. You acknowledge the failure clearly, in the bright light of day, without the protective, distracting shield of self-hatred.
You recognize that suffering and failure are part of the shared human condition, which connects right back to existential isolation.
And by activating the soothing system, you downregulate the amygdala. When the brain feels fundamentally safe, it is drastically more capable of neuroplasticity and behavioral change.
The individual can honestly assess their mistakes and do the difficult work of course correction because the consequence of failure is no longer complete psychological annihilation.
It is the ultimate clinical synthesis. It utilizes the rigorous, habit-changing tools of behaviorism, grounds them in the visceral present-moment awareness developed by Gestalt, applies the absolute unconditional positive regard championed by humanism, and directs all of this energy toward building a life of chosen meaning and values, answering the profound demands of the existentialists.
It's incredible to see it all come together, from Maslow and Rogers showing us our innate potential for growth, to Frankl and Yellowm handing us the heavy keys of freedom and meaning, to Pearls grounding us in the visceral now, and finally to modern mindfulness, teaching us how to treat ourselves with compassion along the way.
When we view this historical trajectory, we see the absolute reclamation of human agency. We are not just vessels for ancient biological drives, nor are we mere clay molded entirely by environmental reinforcement.
We are organisms inherently biased toward growth, burdened by the heavy responsibility of our own freedom, tasked with making meaning in the face of our own mortality, and equipped with the profound capacity to regulate our own nervous systems through mindful self-compassion.
And for anyone engaging with this material, the practical takeaway is a radical shift in your internal dialogue. Remind yourself that your inner dialogue is a choice. When you experience psychological pain, the invitation is to stop diagnosing yourself as a broken mechanism to be fixed.
Instead, approach the pain phenomenologically. Ask what the pain is demanding of you in the present moment, how it relates to your search for meaning, and how you can meet that pain with unconditional regard rather than judgment.
You are a meaning maker capable of infinite growth.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to consider. If the existentialists are correct that the meaning of your life is entirely self-authored, and if the Gestalt framework is accurate in asserting that the present moment is the only true reality that exists,
Does that fundamentally imply that you are actively, literally reconstructing your entire psychological reality second by second, entirely through the specific thoughts and sensations you choose to grant your awareness to?
and if that is the case, what specific reality are you going to choose to build for yourself the moment you take your headphones off?